Linda leaned back in her leather chair at the lawyer's office, crossed one polished heel over the other, and smiled at me like she was watching a stray dog get put out in the rain. That smile, I would come to understand, was the kind that came from a person who had never once questioned their place in the world. It was the smile of someone who believed that destiny had already been written, and that they had been cast as the hero of every story. "Hope you enjoy being homeless," she said, her voice light and cruel, each word landing like a small, deliberate cut. Then she looked me over from my scuffed suitcase to my plain navy blouse and added, "You trash." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and ancient. Trash. It was not the first time someone had called me that. It would not be the last. But something about the setting, the leather chairs, the polished mahogany table, the presence of lawyers and documents in formal proceedings, made the insult feel ceremonial, like a coronation in reverse. Her father, Harold Whittaker, let out a dry little laugh through his nose. Robert was generous to a fault, he said, but even he knew blood comes first. The way he said blood made it sound like a sacred element, something that could not be replicated or earned, only inherited. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, not trusting myself to speak. The truth was, I was not sure I could speak at all. My throat felt like someone had filled it with sand. General Robert Whittaker had been dead 6 days. 6 days since I had stood beside his hospital bed and held the hand that had once pulled me out of a life nobody wanted. 6 days since I had heard his breathing slow, then stop, that terrible and peaceful moment when the rhythm of existence simply ceased. 6 days since the only real father I had ever known left this world, and his family had already changed the locks on the house before the funeral flowers were dry. The estate attorney, Mr. Bellamy, cleared his throat and turned a page. The sound was ordinary, administrative, the kind of sound that fills lawyers' offices every day across America. But for me, it marked the boundary between one life and another. That was the moment, the one people always think revenge stories are really about. The insult, the humiliation, the smug certainty on the faces of people who believe they have won. We love those moments in stories because they promise something. They promise that certainty is fragile, that arrogance has a cost, that the universe, or God, or fate, or simply good planning, keeps a ledger that eventually balances. But my story did not begin in that office, with its leather chairs and cruel smiles and the scent of old paper and fresh betrayal. It began long before that. Back in a part of Missouri where the winters were mean, the summers were sticky, and folks learned early how to keep going whether life was fair or not. It began in a world where children learned to survive before they learned to hope. This is a story about family, both the kind you are born into and the kind you choose, about legacy, about the difference between what people see and what truly matters. And it is a story about a man who understood all of that and spent 12 years quietly preparing for a moment he would never live to see. My name is Emily Whittaker, and this is my story. I was 8 years old when I became an orphan. The word itself felt strange to me then, like a label that belonged to someone else. Orphans were characters in old books, children in distant countries, figures from history. They were not girls from Missouri who had eaten breakfast with their parents that very morning and watched their father kiss their mother on the cheek before heading out to the car. But the world does not care much for the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. It has its own narratives, and they arrive without warning. My parents died on a state highway outside Columbia when a truck slid across black ice and struck their car head-on. At least that is how the social worker explained it to me later, in a tone so practiced and gentle, it sounded like she had said the same words 100 times. Perhaps she had. Perhaps tragedy is common enough that even its telling becomes routine. I do not remember much about the days immediately following the accident. Memory has a way of protecting us, of softening edges and blurring details that would otherwise be too sharp to bear. But I remember the funeral. I remember 2 things clearly. The smell of wet wool coats, the musty, animal scent of fabric that had been caught in the rain and then crowded into a church basement. And the way grown folks would not look me in the eye for very long. There is something particularly devastating about the way adults avoid the gaze of a child who has lost everything. They mean well, I think. They do not want to see the pain, do not want to acknowledge it because acknowledging it would require them to do something, and there is nothing to be done. So they look away. They murmur. They move past. And the child learns one of life's first and hardest lessons. Sometimes there is no one coming to save you. There were no grandparents left to take me. My father's parents had died years earlier, and my mother's mother had passed when I was a toddler. No aunts or uncles willing to step forward. I learned later that there had been conversations, phone calls made in hushed tones, discussions about logistics and finances, and who could possibly manage another mouth to feed. One by one, the names on the county's list fell away, each refusal delivered with regret and practicality in equal measure. And so I entered the foster system carrying a plastic garbage bag filled with my clothes, a church Bible with my mother's name written in the front cover, and the foolish certainty that children have that somebody somewhere would come get them. That certainty, I think, is the most precious and painful gift that childhood bestows. It is the belief that the world is essentially just, that mistakes will be corrected, that families will be reunited, that someone is always coming. Once the misunderstanding was cleared up, nobody came. The misunderstanding, as the social worker called it, was simply that there was no one else. No hidden relatives, no long-lost family friends, no one who remembered a promise made years ago. Just the system, and me, and a garbage bag full of clothes that smelled like a house I would never live in again. I moved through 4 foster homes in 5 years. Some were decent enough, filled with people doing their best in difficult circumstances. Some were not. I was never starved or beaten, and for that I learned to be grateful because the bar gets set low for children with no one to speak for them. Mostly I was tolerated, fed, clothed, sent to school, reminded not to cause trouble. I learned to wash dishes without being asked, to fold laundry without complaint, to stay very quiet when adults were tired or angry or simply not interested in the presence of a child who did not belong to them. I learned not to get attached to rooms or routines or promises. I learned that people mean well often, but meaning well is not the same as being reliable. I learned that the word temporary can describe a placement, a feeling, a hope, or an entire childhood. By the time I turned 13, I had become the kind of child people described as mature for her age, which usually means a child who has learned there is no reward in acting like one. I had learned to read rooms before entering them, to interpret silences, to make myself useful enough to keep but invisible enough not to bother. These are survival skills. They are not the kind you list on a resume, but they are skills nonetheless, and they have served me throughout my life in ways I could not have imagined then. The year I met General Whittaker, I was living with a Methodist couple outside Jefferson City. Their name was Haskins, and they were decent people, older, with grown children of their own who had moved to other states and called on holidays. They took in foster kids because they believed it was the Christian thing to do, and they approached that duty with a stern sense of order and clear expectations. I respected them, but I never mistook duty for love. There is a difference between caring for someone because you have been called to it and caring for someone because you cannot imagine your life without them. Children know that difference, even when they cannot name it. That spring, the county partnered with a veterans charity to host a luncheon and fundraiser for foster children and families connected to military service. I nearly did not go. I had a head cold that had lingered for a week, and I had a dress that pinched under the arms, a hand-me-down from the Haskins granddaughter that had never quite fit right. But Mrs. Haskins insisted. And she was not a woman whose insistence one could easily refuse. So I ended up in a community hall full of folding chairs, sheet cake, weak coffee, and men in blazers decorated with pins from wars I had only read about in school. The room was noisy in the particular way that large gatherings are, a constant hum of conversation and laughter, and the clatter of plates being stacked and restacked. I stood near the dessert table, trying to decide whether taking a second cookie would look greedy. That was when he appeared beside me. He was not hard to notice. General Robert Whittaker was already retired by then, but he carried himself like a man who had never once slouched through life. Tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver hair and deep lines around his eyes that suggested decades of squinting into suns and storms and situations most people never have to face. He had a voice that could fill a room without ever needing to rise, the kind of voice that made people lean in rather than pull back. He was not showy. He just had presence. People made space for him without seeming to know they were doing it. I remember I was standing near the dessert table, one hand hovering near the cookies, when he came up beside me and said, "If you hesitate that long in the field, somebody else gets the last good one." I looked up at him, unsure whether to laugh. His face stayed solemn for another second, then softened. "Go ahead," he said, taking a sugar cookie for himself. "What's your name?" "Marion," I said. "I'm not a Marine." "Not yet," he replied. That was Robert. He did not talk down to children. He spoke to you as if there were already a full person inside you waiting for the world to catch up. We sat at one of the long tables and talked. Or rather, he asked careful questions and actually listened to the answers. He asked what I liked in school. History, I told him. Whether I read much. Whenever I can. Whether I preferred town life or country life. Country, I said, because people leave you alone more. He nodded at that like it was a sensible answer, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, as if he understood exactly what I meant and why I meant it. Over the next few months, he kept showing up. First at charity events, then at the Haskins porch with permission from the county, then for school conferences and Sunday lunches. He had lost his wife, Alina, years earlier to an illness that had taken her slowly, and he had no children of his own. At least no children, he claimed, though he had a younger brother, Harold, and a small orbit of relatives who surfaced mainly at Christmas, and whenever real estate or money got mentioned. I did not trust him at first. A child learns caution the way an old farmer learns weather, quietly and by damage. You watch the sky, you feel the air, you notice the way the birds stop singing, and you learn to read the signs that something is coming. I had learned to expect disappointment. I had learned that promises made to foster children were often made lightly and broken easily. But Robert was patient. He never pushed affection, never made grand speeches, never tried to buy my trust with gifts or favors. He simply did what he said he would do. If he promised to come Saturday, he came Saturday. If he said he would ask about my math grades, he remembered. If I spoke, he listened as if my thoughts were worth the trouble. This is rarer than you might think. Most adults listen to children with half an ear, waiting for them to finish so they can deliver whatever wisdom or correction they have already prepared. Robert listened like what I said mattered. The first time I visited his ranch outside Colorado Springs, I saw open land rolling toward the mountains, a modest but sturdy house with a wraparound porch, a flag snapping in the wind, and a yellow Labrador asleep by the steps. It felt like the kind of place where a person could exhale. "I know it's quiet," he said. "I like quiet," I answered. He looked at me a moment, then said, "I had a feeling." The adoption process took nearly a year. Paperwork, interviews, home visits, legal reviews, background checks, character references. I expected something to go wrong. Good things usually did. I had learned to anticipate the moment when the other shoe would drop, when the social worker would call with an apology, when the placement would fall through. But one crisp October afternoon in a county courtroom that smelled faintly of old files and lemon polish, the judge signed the final order, and I became Emily Whittaker. Robert did not cry. He was not much of a crier. But in the truck afterward, he rested both hands on the steering wheel, looked straight ahead, and said, "Well, I suppose we both got promoted today." That night, sitting on the porch under a cold Colorado sky, I understood something for the first time since my parents died. I was no longer waiting for someone to come for me. They already had. The first winter after the adoption was the coldest I could remember. Colorado winters do not creep in slowly the way Missouri ones do. They arrive like someone threw open a freezer door across the plains. The wind cuts sharp across the ranch, and the mountains sit there in the distance like silent judges, white and implacable. Robert said the cold was good for a person. Builds discipline, he told me one morning while we stood in the barn, our breath fogging the air. I was 15 then, still getting used to the rhythm of life on the ranch. There were horses to brush, fence lines to check, wood to split, and chores that started before sunrise whether you felt like it or not. But Robert never treated those chores like punishment. He treated them like preparation. "Life doesn't owe you comfort," he would say while tightening the saddle straps, "but it does reward effort." Those words stuck with me longer than he probably realized. The ranch sat about 30 minutes outside Colorado Springs, far enough from the city that you could hear coyotes at night, but close enough that we could drive into town for groceries or church on Sundays. The house itself was not fancy. It was a sturdy wood structure built sometime in the 1970s, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Inside, Robert kept things simple. Clean floors, old furniture that had been repaired more times than replaced, and walls decorated with framed photographs from his years in the Marine Corps. Black and white images of young men standing beside helicopters. A faded group photo from Vietnam. A formal portrait of Robert in full dress uniform, medals catching the light. Sometimes I would catch him standing in front of those pictures, hands folded behind his back, staring quietly. Not sad exactly, just remembering. He rarely talked about the war. Older folks understand that kind of silence. Some things belong to memory, not conversation. But what he did talk about often was responsibility. People think strength is loud. He told me one evening while we fixed a broken gate along the back pasture. But the strongest folks I ever met were the quiet ones who kept doing the right thing when nobody was watching. I carried those words with me through high school. By the time I graduated, the idea had already taken hold in my mind. I wanted to serve. Not because Robert pushed me. In fact, he did the opposite. The day I brought home the Marine Corps recruitment pamphlet, he sat at the kitchen table reading it silently for several minutes. Finally, he looked up and said, "You understand what you're signing up for?" "Yes, sir. That life will ask more from you than it gives back." "I know." He studied me the way commanders study a map before committing troops to a mission. Then he nodded. "Well," he said quietly, "the Marine Corps could use a few more people with your stubborn streak." That was the closest thing to approval Robert Whittaker ever gave. Boot camp was the hardest thing I had ever done. Paris Island has a way of stripping a person down to their bare bones. The humidity clings to your skin like a second uniform, and the drill instructors speak a language that consists mostly of shouting. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered Robert standing in the barn that winter morning. Life rewards effort, so I kept going. When I finally graduated and stood on that parade deck wearing the eagle, globe, and anchor for the first time, Robert flew out to South Carolina to watch. He did not cheer like some of the other families. He stood there with his arms folded behind his back, nodding slowly. Later that evening, he shook my hand firmly and said, "Marine," just one word. But it meant everything. Life settled into a steady rhythm after that. Deployments, training rotations, long stretches away from Colorado. And every time I came home on leave, the ranch was the same. Robert on the porch, coffee in hand, the Labrador Duke sleeping at his feet. We would sit there for hours. Sometimes watching the sunset paint the mountains orange and purple. He asked about the Marines. I asked about the ranch. It was a simple life, and for a long time it felt permanent. But time has a way of reminding people that nothing is permanent. Robert turned 82 the year things started to change. At first it was small things. He moved slower when getting out of his chair, forgot where he left his reading glasses, stopped riding horses as often. I noticed it the way daughters notice things before fathers admit them. One evening, I found him in the kitchen staring at the medication bottles lined up beside the sink. "You all right?" I asked. He gave that familiar half-smile, just negotiating with my doctor about who's actually in charge. But the truth came later that year. Cancer. The kind that doctors say with careful voices and folded hands. The kind that doesn't offer much room for negotiation. I took emergency leave and came home. Those months were some of the quietest and hardest of my life. The ranch grew still. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles. Old Marine friends visited and sat with Robert on the porch, telling stories that made them laugh until their eyes watered. Sometimes late at night when the house was quiet, Robert and I would sit together in the living room. He didn't talk about dying. He talked about legacy. "You know something, Emily?" he said one night. "What's that?" "People spend their whole lives chasing money and titles." But in the end, he paused, looking around the house slowly. "The only thing that really matters is whether you left the world better than you found it." I didn't answer. I just listened because deep down, I think I already knew he was saying goodbye. Robert Whittaker passed away on a calm Tuesday morning in early April. The sky was clear. The mountains were still covered in snow. And when the machines in the hospital room finally fell silent, it felt like the strongest pillar in my life had quietly stepped aside. The funeral was held 3 days later in Colorado Springs. Full military honors, Marines in dress blues, a folded flag placed carefully in my hands. And standing across the cemetery watching with dry, calculating eyes were Harold Whittaker and his daughter Linda. Robert's blood family, people who had rarely visited while he was alive, but who now seemed very interested in what he had left behind. At the time, I didn't think much about it. I was too busy grieving. But looking back now, That was the moment the real battle began. The first thing Harold Whittaker did after the funeral was walk straight into Robert's house like he owned it. No hesitation, no pause, just the quiet confidence of a man who had already decided how things were going to end. I remember standing on the porch that afternoon watching the last of the Marines drive away from the ranch. The funeral had been dignified just the way Robert would have wanted, a rifle salute, the bugle playing taps, the flag folded carefully and placed in my hands. For a few minutes afterward, the world had felt strangely peaceful. But peace rarely lasts long when money is involved. Harold stepped inside the house without knocking, his daughter Linda trailing behind him like a shadow dressed in designer sunglasses. Linda looked around the living room as if she were inspecting a hotel suite. "Well," she said, brushing imaginary dust off the back of a chair, "this place hasn't changed much." I stood by the fireplace, still holding the folded flag. "This is Robert's house," I said quietly. Harold gave a thin smile. Was Robert's house. That single word landed heavier than I expected. Grief has a way of making time feel fragile. Robert had been gone less than 48 hours, and already his brother was speaking about him like a completed transaction. Harold walked slowly through the living room, examining things the way buyers do at estate sales. His fingers ran across the wooden shelves Robert had built himself decades earlier. "He always liked this old place," Harold said. He didn't say it with affection, more like mild disappointment. Linda wandered toward the window overlooking the pasture. She stared out at the horses grazing in the distance. "God," she muttered, "all this land so close to Colorado Springs." "Do you know what developers would pay for property like this?" I said nothing. Some people reveal their priorities without realizing it. Linda turned toward me, tilting her head slightly. "So," she said, "when are you leaving?" The question caught me off guard. "I live here," I said. Harold chuckled under his breath. "That's adorable." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a set of papers folded neatly in half. "The estate attorney has already begun the probate process," he said. "And as Robert's only surviving sibling, I'll be overseeing matters." I stared at him. "I'm his daughter." "Adopted daughter," Harold corrected. The way he said it made the word adopted sound like a clerical error. Linda folded her arms. "You can't honestly think Robert left everything to you." I didn't answer because the truth was I didn't know what Robert had done. We had never discussed the details of his will. Not once. Robert believed money had a way of poisoning conversations before the facts even arrived. Harold slid the papers onto the coffee table. "Temporary property access authorization," he explained, "until the will is formally executed." I didn't even look at the documents. "Robert told me to stay here." Harold's smile vanished. Robert also believed stray dogs deserve warm beds. The room went quiet. Linda laughed softly. "I mean, really," she said. "Did you think you were family?" I felt something tighten in my chest, but Robert had taught me something important over the years. Never waste energy arguing with people who have already decided who you are. Harold walked toward the front door and opened it. "We're not monsters," he said casually. "You can have a few days to pack your things. I'm not leaving." He raised an eyebrow. "Emily," he said, using my name in a tone that sounded like someone explaining gravity to a child. "You're a grown woman, a Marine, no less. Surely you can find somewhere else to live." Linda picked up the framed photograph from the mantel, the one showing Robert and me the day I graduated boot camp. She examined it briefly, then set it back down. "You should have stayed in the barracks," she said. 3 days later, they changed the locks. I had been in town buying groceries. When I came back, my key no longer worked. Through the window, I could see movers inside the house carrying boxes from Robert's office. Linda stood in the doorway watching them. She spotted me on the porch and stepped outside. "Oh," she said lightly. "You're back. You changed the locks." She shrugged. "Security. My things are in there. We'll send them somewhere." I looked past her into the living room. Robert's chair was gone. The desk where he wrote letters to old Marine friends was gone. Even the Labrador's bed had disappeared. Something inside me broke quietly then. Not anger, something colder. Linda leaned against the doorframe. "You should probably start looking for an apartment," she said. "Colorado Springs isn't cheap. I'll manage." "I'm sure you will," she replied. Then she smiled, that same smile she would later wear in the lawyer's office, the one that assumed the story had already ended. I left the ranch with one suitcase and a duffel bag. An old Marine buddy of mine named Marcus let me crash on his couch in Denver for a while. He didn't ask many questions. Marines don't always need explanations. Still, something about the whole situation felt wrong. Robert Whittaker had spent his entire life planning 3 moves ahead. He never left loose ends. A week after the funeral, my phone rang. The number belonged to a law office in Colorado Springs. Miss Whittaker, the voice said. Yes. This is Charles Bellamy, your father's estate attorney. I sat up a little straighter. Yes, sir. There will be a formal reading of General Whittaker's will this Friday. I waited. You are required to attend. That was all he said. No explanation, no details, just a time and a place. At the time, I thought it was just another unpleasant formality. Looking back now, that phone call was the beginning of everything. Friday morning came gray and cold, the kind of Colorado spring day that can't decide whether it wants to rain or snow. I drove down from Denver before sunrise in Marcus' old pickup, the heater rattling and blowing mostly lukewarm air. Traffic thickened as I got closer to Colorado Springs. Commuters moving in patient lines, coffee cups in hand, brake lights glowing red in the dim light. Ordinary people heading to ordinary jobs. There was something almost comforting about that. The world keeps going even when your own life feels like it's been split in two. The law office was in an older brick building downtown, just off Tejon Street. Not one of those flashy glass towers with a valet stand and chrome sculpture in the lobby. This place had brass handles on the front doors, wood trim darkened by age, and a reception area that smelled faintly of paper, furniture polish, and old coffee. The kind of office where people handled wills, property disputes, and quiet family wars that never made the newspaper. I parked across the street and sat behind the wheel for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. I had worn civilian clothes on purpose. Nothing dramatic. A navy blouse, gray slacks, low heels. My service years had taught me that sometimes composure unsettles cruel people more than visible pain does. Inside, the receptionist, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned neatly back, looked up and gave me a small, kind nod. Miss Whittaker. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Bellamy is expecting you. Conference room at the end of the hall. Her voice softened just a little when she added, I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. I walked down a narrow hallway lined with framed certificates, military commendation plaques, and landscape paintings of the Front Range. Halfway down, I could already hear Linda's voice. She was laughing. Not the laugh people use when something is genuinely funny. The other kind, sharp and performative. The kind meant to make sure everyone in earshot knows exactly who feels superior. When I stepped into the conference room, Harold was seated at the far side of a long, polished table, a stack of folders in front of him like he was preparing to lead a board meeting. Linda sat to his right, immaculate as always, in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my first used car. She looked me over slowly from head to toe and smiled. Well, she said. She came. Harold turned his head, gave me one brief glance, and then looked back down at his watch. Sit wherever you like, he said. This shouldn't take long. I took the chair nearest the door. Mr. Charles Bellamy entered a moment later, carrying a legal file box and a yellow notepad. He was in his 70s, tall and spare with a careful face, and the kind of steady movements that come from decades of doing exacting work. I had met him only twice before, both times in passing, but Robert trusted him, and that mattered to me. He set the box on the table and looked at each of us in turn. Thank you all for coming, he said. As counsel to the late General Robert Whittaker, I'm here to conduct the formal reading of his last will and testament, along with associated estate instructions and trust provisions. Linda leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. Let's get on with it, she said. Mr. Bellamy adjusted his glasses, but did not hurry. There's something older Americans understand well, the difference between people who respect process and people who only tolerate it when they think it will favor them. He opened the main file and began. The first pages were exactly what I expected. Formal language, dates, signatures, witness declarations. Then came the distribution of specific personal property. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway went a herald. A set of military commemorative firearms properly registered and secured was to be transferred through legal channels to Harold as well. The ranch house itself, along with the surrounding acreage, was left to the Whittaker family line under Harold's administration. Linda's mouth curled before the sentence was even over. I sat still. Mr. Bellamy continued. A vintage truck. Several pieces of Alina Whittaker's jewelry. Robert's coin collection. The horses with detailed care instructions and funding set aside for their upkeep until sold or rehomed under specified standards. On and on it went, each item crossing the table like another shovelful of dirt thrown onto the grave of the life I thought I had. Linda turned toward me with open satisfaction. Now she no longer even bothered to hide it. "This must be difficult," she said in a tone that suggested the opposite. Harold gave her a mild warning look, but not because he objected, only because he wanted the room to stay respectable. I kept my eyes on the polished wood grain of the table. Robert had taught me years earlier that dignity is often just endurance dressed in silence. When Mr. Bellamy reached the final page of the will, he paused. Harold straightened in his chair. Linda sat forward. Mr. Bellamy closed the folder carefully and placed both hands on it. "That concludes the primary testamentary document," he said. Linda let out a breathy laugh. "Well," she said, glancing at me, "I suppose that settles it. There remains," Mr. Bellamy said without raising his voice, "one final section." The room changed. It was subtle but unmistakable. The air tightened. Harold's expression shifted by half a degree. Linda blinked, then sat back. Mr. Bellamy opened a second file from the box. This one was thinner, bound with a red ribbon tag and stamped with a date from nearly 12 years earlier. Harold frowned. "What is that?" "A separate instrument executed under the authority of General Whittaker's Estate Planning Council," Bellamy said. "It concerns assets held outside the probate estate." Linda looked confused for the first time that morning. Outside the estate, Mr. Bellamy removed a document and began to read. "Pursuant to the Whittaker Family Preservation Trust, later amended and restated under private management provisions, the grantor directs that all non-probate holdings, including designated investment accounts, controlling business interests, real estate partnerships, and reserve funds, shall pass in full to the sole named beneficiary, Emily Whittaker." For one full second, nobody spoke. I wasn't even sure I had heard him correctly. Then Linda laughed once sharply. "That's ridiculous." Harold's face had gone flat. "There must be some mistake." "There is no mistake," Mr. Bellamy replied. He placed several papers on the table and slid copies across to each of us. Harold snatched his up first. Linda scanned hers, her mouth slowly parting. Mr. Bellamy continued in the same calm tone. "General Whittaker established this trust over a period of many years. It includes income from consulting agreements, investment growth, retained equity in a defense logistics firm, municipal bond holdings, and 3 income-producing commercial properties located in Colorado and Texas." The words sounded unreal, abstract, like someone reading the inventory of another person's life. Linda looked up at me, then back down at the pages as though the numbers might change if she blinked hard enough. Harold's jaw worked once. Mr. Bellamy turned a page. "As of the most recent valuation, the total net worth of the trust assets assigned to Emily Whittaker is approximately $32.8 million. Linda pushed back from the table so suddenly her chair legs scraped hard across the floor. Harold slapped his palm against the document. "That is impossible." But Mr. Bellamy, who had likely spent half his life watching families unravel over paper and signatures, did not flinch. Across from me, Linda's face had gone white. And then, just as Robert must have predicted years earlier, they started screaming. Linda was the first to lose control completely. "This is fraud," she shouted, shoving the papers back across the table so hard that one of the pages slid onto the floor. "This is absolute fraud. He never would have done this. Never." Harold didn't shout right away. Men like him often don't. Not at first. They go cold before they go loud. His face tightened, and he picked up the trust summary with both hands as though the document itself had insulted him. "Charles," he said in a voice so controlled it trembled at the edges, "you need to explain this very carefully." Mr. Bellamy folded his hands on the table. "I already have." "No," Harold snapped. "You've read out a fantasy. My brother was an old man, sick, vulnerable. If you expect me to believe he handed a fortune to," he stopped himself before he finished the sentence, but the meaning was already there. "To her, to the orphan, to the outsider." Mr. Bellamy looked at him steadily. "General Whittaker established the trust long before his illness," he said. "The originating documents date back 12 years. The amendments were executed over time, witnessed, notarized, and reviewed by independent counsel. His medical competency was evaluated when required. Everything was done properly." Linda let out a bitter laugh. "Convenient." "It was thorough," Bellamy corrected. "I still hadn't said anything. Truthfully, I was struggling to take in the numbers. $32 million did not sound like a real number to me, not in relation to my own life. I understood monthly pay, mortgage payments, used trucks, ranch supply costs, the price of feed and boots and hotel rooms off base. But millions on paper, commercial properties, consulting income, equity holdings, that belonged to another world. Mr. Bellamy opened a separate folder and turned it toward me. General Whittaker was methodical, he said. He did not discuss these assets widely, but he managed them carefully. Some were inherited from Mrs. Whittaker's family. Others came from long-term investments and defense consulting after his retirement. He instructed that the trust remain private until his death. Harold stood up so suddenly his chair rocked backward. This will be contested. Bellamy nodded once. You are free to pursue that. I should advise you that the trust includes a no-contest clause attached to several secondary bequests. That landed. Harold froze. Meaning what? Meaning, Bellamy said, that if certain named parties challenge the trust unsuccessfully, they risk forfeiting associated inheritances already granted under the probate estate. Linda turned on her father. What does that mean? The ranch. Does that mean the ranch? It means, Bellamy replied, General Whittaker anticipated conflict. For the first time since I'd known Harold Whittaker, he looked less like a man in command and more like a man arriving late to a war he thought had already been won. Linda looked back at me then, and the expression on her face had changed. The mockery was still there, but now it was mixed with something uglier. Fear. Did you know? She asked. I met her eyes. No, you expect me to believe that. I don't particularly care what you believe. It was the first thing I'd said since the reading began, and the room went quiet for a second after I said it. Mr. Bellamy slid another document toward me. There is more, he said. Linda threw up her hands. Of course there is. Bellamy ignored her. General Whittaker also left written instructions and a sealed personal statement for Miss Whittaker. Those are not part of the public reading. Harold gave a short, disgusted exhale. How touching. But Bellamy was already returning the main papers to the file box. The formal reading was over. At least the legal part was. The emotional part was just beginning. Linda snatched up her handbag and pointed a finger at me across the table. You think this makes you one of us? No, I said quietly. I never did. That seemed to hit her harder than anger would have. Some people build their whole identity around exclusion. If you refuse to fight for a seat at their table, they don't know what to do with you. Harold gathered his papers with clipped, angry movements. You may have fooled Robert, he said, but don't think money changes what you are. I stood up slowly. Money did not change what I was. He was right about that. Robert had changed what I was years ago when he gave me a name, a home, and a standard to live by. The money was just proof that he had seen me clearly all along. I never asked him for any of it, I said. Harold stared at me, but there was no answer in his face, only resentment. Deep old resentment, the kind that had probably lived in him for years before I ever came into the picture. Linda moved toward the door first, still muttering under her breath. Harold followed a step behind. Neither offered condolences, neither offered dignity, but that was no longer my burden to carry. When the door shut behind them, the whole room seemed to exhale. Mr. Bellamy removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I apologize for the unpleasantness, he said. You don't need to apologize. No, he said gently, but I wanted to. I sat back down. My hands were steady, but only because Marines learn early that steadiness and peace are not the same thing. Bellamy opened the smaller file again and removed a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. My name was written across the front in Robert's unmistakable hand. Emily, just that. No rank, no title, no formality. I looked at it for several seconds before reaching for it. He left instructions, Bellamy said, that this be given to you in private after the reading. There is also an audio recording and a memorandum explaining the structure of the trust in practical terms. I can walk you through all of it today, or we can schedule another meeting if you'd prefer time. I swallowed once. Today. He nodded. Good. That's probably wise. He then spent the next half hour explaining what Robert had built in the shadows while the rest of us were living ordinary days. 3 commercial properties with long-term tenants. Conservative investment accounts managed for growth and preservation. Income from a defense consulting business Robert had partly founded after retirement, though he had quietly stepped back from the public side years ago. A trust board that would now answer to me. It was not flashy money. It was old, disciplined money. The kind built by patience, caution, and planning. The kind Robert respected. And the more Bellamy explained, the more one truth became unavoidable. This had not been an impulse. This had been a message. Not just to Harold and Linda, to me. By the time he finished, the envelope in my hand felt heavier than all $32 million, because I knew before I even broke the seal that whatever Robert had written in that letter was the real inheritance. I did not open Robert's letter right away. Some things deserve a moment of silence before you face them. Mr. Bellamy left me alone in the conference room after we finished reviewing the documents. The afternoon sun had begun to shift through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the polished wood table. Outside, traffic moved steadily along the street, people carrying on with their ordinary Friday routines. Inside that room, my entire life had just changed. But the envelope in my hands felt heavier than the fortune Robert had left behind. The wax seal cracked softly when I broke it. Inside was a handwritten letter on thick cream paper along with a small flash drive. Robert's handwriting had always been strong and deliberate, each letter formed with the precision of a man who believed words should be chosen carefully. I unfolded the page. "Emily, if you are reading this, it means the old Marine finally ran out of time." That was the first line. I smiled despite myself. It sounded exactly like him. I sat down again and continued reading. There are things I chose not to explain while I was alive, not because I didn't trust you, but because timing matters in life. Sometimes people need to reveal themselves before the truth can do its proper work. The words were steady, calm, like Robert speaking across the porch on a quiet evening. You may be wondering why I structured my estate the way I did. The answer is simple. I wanted to see who people really were. I leaned back slightly in the chair. Robert had always believed that character revealed itself under pressure. The letter continued, "Harold and Linda are not evil people, Emily, but they are weak in the ways that matter most. They have spent most of their lives believing that entitlement is the same thing as inheritance. It is not. Real inheritance is responsibility." My throat tightened a little as I read. Robert had never been a man who wasted words. I gave them the ranch and the visible assets because that is what they always believed mattered. Land, objects, appearances. But the real work, the real legacy, I entrusted to you. I paused. The room felt quieter somehow. You never asked me for anything, not once. You worked, you served, you carried yourself with dignity, even when life treated you unfairly. That told me everything I needed to know. A memory surfaced in my mind. Robert standing in the barn years earlier, watching me struggle to lift a heavy saddle when I was still too small to manage it properly. He had not rushed in to help. He had simply stood there, letting me figure it out. Robert believed strength was built, not given. The letter continued, "Money is not the point of the trust. If it becomes the point, then I failed as a father." I felt my chest tighten. The point is what you will do with it. Our country is full of men and women who served and came home to nothing. I saw it in every war. Veterans sleeping in their trucks, families losing homes while politicians gave speeches about honor. If you are the woman I believe you are, you will know what to do. At the bottom of the page, Robert had written one final sentence. "Build something that helps people stand up again." Below that was his signature, Robert Whittaker. I sat there for a long time after finishing the letter. Eventually, I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. It contained a short video recording Robert had made months earlier. The camera angle was slightly crooked, like someone had set it up without caring much about production quality. Robert sat at his kitchen table on the ranch, the same table where we used to drink coffee in the mornings. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, but his eyes were still sharp. "Well," he said into the camera, "if you're watching this, it means Bellamy did his job, and the plan worked." He paused and leaned back in his chair. "I'm not leaving you money so you can live comfortably and forget the rest of the world," he continued. "I'm leaving it to you because I trust you to carry forward something better." He looked directly into the camera. "Service doesn't end when you take off the uniform." The video ended there. No dramatic speech, no sentimental farewell, just the truth Robert had always lived by. Later that evening, I drove back toward Denver with the letter resting on the passenger seat. The mountains were glowing gold under the setting sun. I thought about the ranch, about Harold and Linda celebrating their victory, unaware that the real decision had already been made years earlier. But the strange thing was, I didn't feel anger anymore. Not the burning kind people expect in revenge stories. What I felt was something quieter. Purpose. Robert had not handed me a weapon. He had handed me a responsibility. And the first step toward honoring that responsibility came sooner than I expected because 3 weeks later, I attended a meeting at the Denver Veterans Resource Center. The building was old and worn, but the people inside were trying to do something good. They were short on funding, short on housing, short on everything except determination. As I sat in the back row listening to the director explain how many veterans were sleeping in cars across Colorado, Robert's words echoed in my mind. Build something that helps people stand up again. For the first time since the will reading, I understood exactly what my father had meant. The real inheritance wasn't revenge. It was the chance to do something that mattered. The first building I bought was a worn-out 2-story property on the edge of Colorado Springs, not far from the old rail line, and close enough to public transportation that a man without a car could still make it to a doctor's appointment or a job interview. 10 years earlier, I might have driven past it without a second glance. Its brick exterior was weathered. The windows needed replacing. The front steps leaned slightly to one side, and the plumbing inspection report looked like a list of warnings from the Book of Revelation. But Robert had taught me not to confuse rough condition with lack of value. I bought it through the trust, hired local contractors, and spent the next year turning it into transitional housing for veterans, especially older veterans, the men and women who had served decades earlier and somehow slipped through every crack America claims not to have. Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Different wars, same loneliness. The center wasn't fancy. It had clean beds, hot meals, case management, transportation support, and a common room with comfortable chairs, a television, shelves of donated books, and a coffee station that was never empty. We added a counseling office, legal aid appointments twice a month, and a job placement partnership with local businesses willing to hire older workers who still wanted purpose. I named it the Whitaker House, not because Robert would have wanted his name on a building. He probably would have grumbled about that, but because I wanted every person who entered that place to know it existed, because one good man believed legacy should mean something. Word spread. One building became 2, then a scholarship fund for military families, then emergency grants for veterans facing eviction. I kept my Marine pensions separate and lived simply the same way I always had. I bought a modest home not far from the ranch, but not on it. I drove a dependable pickup, not a luxury SUV. I still clipped coupons when I remembered, still compared prices at the grocery store. Money changes some people by making them larger versions of who they already were. In my case, I think it simply gave me the ability to act on values that were already there. That mattered to me. It would have mattered to Robert, too. As for Harold and Linda, I wish I could tell you the money humbled them immediately. Life is rarely that tidy. They contested nothing, which told me Bellamy's warning about the no contest clause had landed exactly as Robert intended. Harold kept the ranch. Linda kept circling around whatever share of the visible estate she believed she deserved. For a while, that seemed to be enough for them. But time works on people. It wears down certainty, softens pride, exposes consequences. About 4 years after the will reading, I got a call from Bellamy. Harold had suffered a mild stroke. He was recovering, but slower now, less certain. Linda's second marriage had fallen apart, and some bad investment decisions, hers, not Robert's, had left her in a position she had not imagined possible. She wants to speak with you, Bellamy said. I was quiet for a moment. About money. I suspect, he said with lawyerly care, that she wants to speak about more than that. We met at a diner in Monument halfway between Colorado Springs and Denver, the kind of diner older Americans know well. Vinyl booths, bottomless coffee, pie rotating in a glass case, and a waitress who calls everyone hun. Linda looked older than the woman who had mocked me in Bellamy's office. Not ruined, just real. The polish was still there, but the certainty was gone. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and stared down into it before speaking. I was awful to you, she said. There was no drama in it, no tears, no long speech trying to excuse herself. Just the truth set plainly on the table between us. Yes, I said. She nodded. I used to think if someone else got something, it meant there'd be less left for me. She gave a humorless smile. Turns out that's a terrible way to live. I didn't rush to comfort her. At our age, or at least by the age many of my listeners know well, there comes a point when apologies matter most if they are allowed to stand on their own feet. After a while, she said, he loved you like a daughter. Yes, I said quietly. He did. She looked up then, and for the first time there was no bitterness in her face, only regret. I think that's what I hated, she said. Not you, just that he saw something in you he never saw in us. I thought about correcting her, about telling her Robert had probably seen exactly what was in all of us, and that was the point. But age teaches another lesson, too. Not every truth needs sharpening before it is spoken. Few months later, I visited Harold at the ranch. He looked smaller in his armchair than I remembered. Older, a little frail. The house itself felt the same, though. Sun through the windows, the old wood floors, the porch facing the mountains. For one painful second, I could almost imagine Robert stepping in from outside, brushing dust from his hands. Harold gestured toward the chair across from him. "You've done well," he said. It was not warmth, but it was honest. "I've tried to do right by him," I answered. He sat quietly for a long moment. Then he said, "I was wrong about you." Coming from Harold, that was a confession. I did not ask for more than he could give. We spoke for another half-hour about ordinary things, the condition of the fencing, the cost of repairs, the way Colorado keeps growing whether old families like it or not. When I left, he did not hug me. He was not that kind of man, but he did walk me to the porch. For us, that was enough. People often think revenge means watching someone else suffer. At first glance, maybe my story looks like that. The insult, the will, the screaming, the reversal. But that was never the true ending. The true ending was this. I was an orphan, and one honorable man chose me. He gave me a name, a home, and a set of values sturdy enough to outlast money, cruelty, and grief. His family threw me out, yes, but in the end, I was never truly cast out. Because what Robert left me was not just wealth. It was direction. And maybe that's the lesson I'd leave with you today, especially if you've lived long enough to know how complicated families can be. Blood may introduce us, but character is what keeps us. Family is not always the people who share your name. Sometimes it is the person who sees you clearly when no one else does. Sometimes it is the hand that pulls you out of darkness. Sometimes it is the legacy left behind, not in property or possessions, but in values and expectations and the quiet belief that you are capable of more than you know. If this story stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you of someone you've loved, lost, forgiven, or still need to forgive, I hope you'll carry that reflection with you. Robert used to say that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. I think he was right. Sometimes it begins at home. Sometimes it begins with a choice to see someone fully, to believe in them completely, to build something that outlasts us all. If you believe stories like this still matter, I'd be honored if you shared it with someone who might need it. Leave a comment telling me about someone who changed your life. Someone who saw you when you felt invisible. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this one. And remember, the greatest inheritance we can leave behind is not what we accumulate, but what we build in others. Until next time, keep standing up. Keep moving forward. And never forget that your story is not over until you say it is.